Good evening, everyone. I'm Kimberlé Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we welcome you to part 3 of our weekly webinar, Under the Blacklight, the Intersectional Vulnerabilities that COVID lays bare. So we warned, we worried, and we knew. Yet the racialized impact of COVID-19 escaped mainstream media's attention until now. The racial contours of the disease have been its least discussed dimension, particularly as compared to other risk factors. From the beginning, we knew that older populations and those with underlying conditions were at greater risk. It later emerged that the disease was even more lethal for men than for women. But weeks have passed without the overlay of race to help us think clearly about the lethality of this disease to different populations. So when one takes race into account, the definition of older Americans may shift. Perhaps older means 50 and up, given the weathering of Black bodies as a consequence of societal factors, including stress. Maybe race will be as salient as age and gender, particularly as they intersect. Men might be more vulnerable than women overall, but race suggests that Black men will be even more vulnerable than white men. Yes, this is certainly complex, which makes it all the more critical that we confront the racial contours of COVID. Yet efforts to sound this alarm, and I've seen it quite personally, have been delayed, often with a hint of the disciplinary, well, we're all in this together. Now that the death toll has reached 5 figures, these important conversations are delayed only at our peril. So today we turn more directly to those racial dimensions that are laid bare, exploring through a cross-racial lens the many aspects of vulnerability that we are seeing. We have in past weeks touched on the disproportionate risks and burdens faced by economically marginalized communities, in particular, workers who are essential but expendable, those who lack access to work, resources, and housing. Today, we want to squarely confront the racial dimensions of COVID, those aspects of the crises that intersect with our distinct racial history, a history defined by race and racism, capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperialism, none of which operate alone, yet all are which are definitively active in this moment. So we'll start in our first segment of the night by hearing from Rinku Sen, co-president of the Women's March Board. We'll hear from Asali Devan Ecclesiastes, author, educator, and community developer, and Dallas Goldtooth, leader of Keep It in the Ground campaign. We'll take a quick look to check in on the conversation happening out there in virtual universe. And then we'll come back and hear from Danny Hosang, professor of ethnicity, race and migration studies and American studies at Yale University, Mari Matsuda, law professor and critical race theorist, and Rosa Clemente, president and founder of Know Thyself Productions. Now, throughout this Social Justice SOS event, we want to hear from you. So please share your thoughts in the Zoom chat room or tweet us at AA Policy Forum. Please expand the conversation across social media by following AAPF on Twitter and Facebook and using the hashtags Social Justice SOS and AAPF COVID. You can send comments and questions to our panelists through the Zoom platform over here. We'll be sharing them with our panelists, and time permitting, we might even take a few live questions. So let's dive in with Rinku Sen, co-president of the Women's March. Rinku, you're on the ground right now in Queens, New York, near Elmhurst Hospital. Can you paint a picture for listeners about what's happening there? Perhaps we might call this at least one of the epicenters within the epicenter.
Yeah, thank you so much for including me in this discussion. I am in Rico Park, Queens. I'm about a mile and a half from Elmhurst Hospital, which is the all-COVID hospital here. And a couple of things to know are that New York City is eerily quiet. This is a noisy city. Things are always happening here, right through to the middle of the night, and there are no sounds. There's no traffic. There's no voices. There's nobody fighting on the street. There's nobody playing on the street. So just that is kind of surreal. We are in a situation where New York City's death toll, it constitutes about 2/3 of New York State's, and New York State is the vast majority of people dying in the US, in the country. And in New York City, we have 5 boroughs: Manhattan and Staten Island, Brooklyn, Bronx, and Queens. And the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn are the boroughs of color. Manhattan and Staten Island are much whiter in their populations. And you can see from the map that where the real hotspots are and where people are getting sickest and dying most are in Brooklyn and Queens, Queens even higher than Brooklyn. And so much of that is because that's where not just people of color live, but it's where essential workers live. In New York, we have a thing called the bridge and tunnel metaphor, because you have to either get on a bridge or get in a tunnel in order to get from the boroughs to Manhattan. So it's your bridge and tunnel crowd and workers who are unable to not work and unable to get to work without riding on mass transit. That's the only way in New York to get to work. So we are just reeling from the death toll. My phone messages and social media feeds are full of that, as I'm sure is true for others as well. And we're really seeing how the income and race demographics of the city play out when there is a global pandemic.
Yes, yes. So you're describing what we've been calling the essential but expendable workers, the disposable workers. I'm wondering whether what you're seeing in Queens might be amplified by hotspots across the country. We've been hearing things out of Chicago and hearing things out of Milwaukee. The list goes on. What do these tales of death and disease have in common?
You're asking me that, yes, Kim?
Yes.
Thank you. So I think that some of what they have in common is the dismissal of people of color with symptoms. They also have in common that many of the workers are of color. So the health workers, the sanitation workers, the transit workers. In New York, we've had a high number of transit workers die because they're shuttling people around. And I think I've seen similar numbers in Chicago and Detroit and other places. So I think what you're seeing is the concentration of people of color, which is about segregation and housing affordability and transportation. That segregation creating a whole bunch of systems around it: segregated workplaces, segregated hospitals, segregated transportation. And, you know, Elmhurst is a public hospital, and I do think the public hospitals are getting hit with, you know, all of the patients who don't have health insurance and who are coming in for emergency care, who don't have access to telemedicine. In Queens, it's very Asian. So you have Asians working in the healthcare industry and also Asian patients and just Asian people who are experiencing hate crimes, in addition to other kinds of discrimination. So I think, you know, I'm going to point to segregation as a key theme, racist segregation as one of the reasons we're seeing this happen all over the country.
Thank you, Rico. Well, like you, Asali is also on the, I guess we could call it the geographic and social front lines of the disease. Similar to Queens, we're seeing devastation ravaging Louisiana. So for example, coroners in St. John the Baptist Parish are saying that people are dropping like flies, quote. Now we're nearing the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And as we approach it, New Orleans is once again being swept away by the intersection of tragedy and pre-existing inequality. So Asali, what are you seeing, and what are the particular inequalities defining this moment in what we could call the city that care forgot?
Well, for us, and this is not new, as you talked about in your opening. These are just issues that the current crisis is laying bare. But we live in a place where Blackness itself is an underlying condition. In the city of New Orleans, in the state of Louisiana, we have been ravaged for decades by policies, by multinational corporations who are allowed to pollute our neighborhoods, who are intentionally placed in our communities. You mentioned St. John the Baptist Parish. That community in particular experiences the highest rates of cancer anywhere in the country. So, it's only logical, it's only a natural thought that they would now be experiencing rates of COVID at the highest. And in New Orleans, we passed 5,000 cases today, and that is over that's 13% of our population. So that means everybody in every neighborhood, in every community, in every kinship and affinity group all know someone. This is all hitting at the gut level, whether it be the health or whether it be the economic distress, which are of course deeply intertwined. The communities which we serve at Ashe Cultural Arts Center, and particularly our cultural workers, who make up the reason that people know and love New Orleans, who create the industry, the biggest industry in our city, are also the most adversely impacted. You're hearing about our musicians and our Mardi Gras Indians and our second liners at vast rates, in addition to our healthcare workers. So it's really emotional for a community that already experiences a 25-year difference in life expectancy.
Yeah, wow. And as almost on point with the conversation, it seems as though we're being Zoom bombed with a lot of and Nazi symbols.
Somebody's bored.
I guess the one thing that we could say about that is, if there are any people in our audience who think, well, maybe, this is an exaggeration, we're talking about issues that no longer exist, Exhibit A, right? Exhibit A is right here. So we're not going to freak out about it. We're going to use this sort of like as the downbeat. This is what we are up against in this moment. It kind of reminds me of those moments in the civil rights movement where they were having freedom, congregations to get ready for marches, and the Klan circled them outside. Yes. Right? It just redoubled their efforts and their energy, to sing of freedom at the top of their lungs. We're going to talk about freedom at the top of our lungs.
Come on now.
Not let any of this craziness turn us around, because we are here and we got stuff to talk about. So from what you've been seeing in Louisiana, are there some factors that just aren't being talked about as much as they should be? Awesome.
Well, I will say that I am happy that the governor acknowledged, the state of things to a certain extent. But no, certainly it's not being talked about the way that it should be. Personally, in my work and with my projects, we've been ringing the alarm about the 25-year difference in life expectancy. When that data came out 6 or 7 years ago, I was like, that's a public health emergency. Hey, this is crazy, y'all. Let's do something about this. And it was like, oh yeah, that's crazy. Now, what were we doing? And So there's no sense of urgency, you know, as was mentioned earlier about the way our pain is treated inside of the healthcare system, the way our systems are treated, the way our humanity is viewed is evidence inside of these statistics. And, you know, it's not because of anything genetic or inherent, or we didn't choose to move to the places where environmental racism exists. Environmental racism exists because we live there. And
Yeah, yeah,
right, you
right,
know, things
right.
are, policies are created, you know, projects are developed intentionally in those communities, highways you know, are put
Oh, yeah.
intentionally in those communities, you know, for a purpose of creating the exact outcomes we're experiencing.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, we want to come back around to that, you know, in a bit. Just the way the conversation is framed sometimes projects onto the community or into the body the vulnerability rather than focusing on the agency of those who place these environmental toxins in our community.
That's right.
Or other stressors in the society that then become part of our health prognosis. I want to bring Dallas in. So, you know, building on the images that Asali and Rinku are painting for us, could you tell us about what you're seeing in Indian country? I know we've been reading about hotspots in Indian country, Navajo Nation in particular. What is the virus doing there? What is it threatening to do?
Well, I want to say first, thank you for having me on this this webinar here. I'm so happy to share this space with so many beautiful people sharing great knowledge. It's pretty dire across what is quote unquote Indian country, the indigenous diaspora of Native folks here in the so-called United States. You know, in particular, a major concern right now is this explosion of cases are happening down in the Navajo Nation, which is in the Southwest region, where they currently have around 430 cases right now, and 17 people have already died. Now, these are tight-knit communities that are pretty remote unto themselves. I mean, Navajo Nation, I think that 70% of people have electricity. The remaining do not have electricity or running water in their homes. We have, you know, one of the huge issues here is that Navajo Nation is a nation of 90,000 citizens, and they only have 2 hospitals. And
Stop for a moment. Wait, 2 hospitals for 90,000 people.
That's right.
Okay.
I got a cousin that is Navajo, that if they wanted to go to the hospital, it's a good 1.5-hour drive to 2-hour drive for them. I mean, this is, and now we're dealing with the idea of like the concept, the reality of a pandemic, you know, as epidemic of disease coming into this community. It's terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. So I'm sure that that's shocking in and of itself, but you know, like when one pulls the lens back to talk about why Native American communities are being so hard hit by the pandemic, what comes to mind as, you know, the precursors to this moment with respect to the neglect and mistreatment that this crisis is exacerbating?
Well, I think it's a great question. I want to also note that the hospitals there, so that they're doing their best and like amazing like appreciation to a lot of the healthcare providers on the ground who many of themselves are Navajo themselves, helping and working within their own community. Indian country is pretty wide. I mean, there's the Indian Health Service is a federal program where it's to help provide health services to Native communities. There's over 2 million people in that system, and they only have under 30 ICU beds. You know, they only have, and I think the last number before this last stimulus package, under 50 ventilators for a system that's supposed to serve between 1.5 and 2 million Native peoples. What this is just demonstrates that the system was flawed before this pandemic even happened.
Yes.
That there's the vast inequity in this country becomes much more apparent as we're starting to deal with this health crisis at this current time.
Yeah. Those are sobering numbers, and it's important that we recognize that although we're focusing, the media is focusing on one hot spot, there are many across the country, and all reflect a failure to prepare and a failure to recognize the most vulnerable who will suffer because of that lack of preparation. Thank you, Dallas. So I want to stop now and take a social media check-in. I'm sure it's hot right now. So Janine Irving is AAPF's social media director. Give us a brief rundown about what we've been hearing online so far.
Hi, Kim. Once again, I really want to thank everyone who is contributing to the chat in our Zoom chat, everyone who is making some really incredible comments online on our Twitter accounts at AA Policy Forum, and also for our podcast forum at IMKC _podcast. A lot of people are talking about, first of all, the Zoom bombing. This is, of course, our third week. This is the first time this has happened to us. So some of the comments are that, that we must be talking about something incredibly important if we've got this type of attention. A lot of people are, of course, again, talking about frontline workers, people who are in the struggle, people who are absolutely being tasked with supporting our communities and who are, of course, becoming sick and sometimes dying from the COVID-19. Let's see what we've got here. We've got people who are in solidarity, people who are really discussing what it's like to suffer under this process, being Indigenous, being religious, and of course being a person of color. So we've got a lot of great comments going on right now.
Great. Thank you, Janine. It's great to hear that the conversation has not been interrupted. That's exactly what we're here for. So back to our panelists. So we want to sort of broaden the lens a little bit on the racialized impact to talk about the fact that these pictures that we've been painting, these snapshots, until this moment, pretty much escaped mainstream media's attention. And I want to point mainstream, independent media has been there. So I want to turn to the next group of panelists to talk about a broader frame, right? The political and historical context that's contributed to these outcomes. So I want to start with Danny Hosang, professor of ethnicity, race and migration studies and American studies at Yale University. So Danny, we've been hearing about the growing number of cases of anti-Asian harassment and violence since this pandemic broke. So I want to hear more about that, and also your thoughts. What might this be telling us about how deep these racist sentiments actually run, and I guess also what are we not being told in the way the media is covering these moments of anti-Asian violence?
Well, thank you, Kim, and thank you for these just amazing webinars, a chance for us to learn from another. It's a really important question. Maybe a little background would help here. About a week and a half ago, colleagues at San Francisco State, Russell Jung, and a set of community organizations set up an online platform for people to register incidents of anti-Asian violence, discrimination, and harassment. In just a few days, the website was flooded, something like 1,200 incidents reported in less than a week. And I think it's important to know this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many more examples of bullying, harassment, just in these very everyday ways, schools, businesses, communities, trains, everywhere. And yes, this is fueled by Trump's very prominent racist description of the so-called Chinese virus, the Kung Fu flu, and a long-standing racist campaign on the right. But I think it's a mistake to just think about this as individual bigotry or narrow-mindedness. There's other things happening. And just remember, in early January, when news of this was coming, what was so many of the public's first reaction? Stop going to places where associated with Asian bodies. In Chinatown, Chinese restaurants, deserted, Lunar New Year festivals canceled. In Southern California, just around the time in the same areas where Kobe Bryant lived and after he passed, parents there began pulling their kids out of schools with large numbers of Asian American students in very blue liberal areas. there was a petition with something like 14,000 signatures to close one high school in particular in Southern California in the name of protecting the community from what they called the Wuhan virus. So you know, this runs far, far deeper. It would be easier if it were just the work of a small number of narrow-minded people, but it's a reminder of how deep and profound these ideas run.
So, and I know some part of this, and actually some part of what the media haven't covered, is that there is a history behind this. This isn't just, you know, the first moment that Asian Americans have been subject to this kind of violence and this kind of framing. Yet, you know, for the most part, it's sort of like, oh, look at this. How about this? What is it important for people to bring from history forward to understand how this is a reproduction of themes from the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can really think about this as a 19th century reaction to a 21st century pandemic. The association, I mean, how deep this association between bodies and certain kind of disease run. So, you know, I mean, the short history is in the 19th century, Chinatowns, Chinese workers, Chinese communities were always associated with disease, contagion. And rather than looking, I mean, there's parallels here to New Orleans at the sets of underlying social conditions that make people vulnerable to that, the disease is attached to the bodies. And gets transposed onto immigrants from Mexico, you know, in the early 20th century. It's also connected to the myths that were coming early on about Black bodies as somehow being immune to this, the very ways that like racial particularity gets attached to this. So, I mean, this is really expressive of a long history of medical and scientific racism. It's baked into our public health system about the ways we think about who possibly can get contaminated with the disease, who can't. And I think it goes a long way to explaining the complacency, the notion that diseases affect some kinds of degenerate people, they're culturally associated, rather than understanding how they actually spread through populations and contexts. And just the last thing I want to add about this is that the New York Times, well into February, constantly referred to this as the Wuhan virus. Their very first online maps referred to this as the Wuhan virus. Stories constantly did that. It shows us just how deep-seated this is in our culture. And it was to all of our devastating effects to not take seriously, to be preoccupied with these racial and cultural explanations and not take seriously what was actually happening.
You know, you raise the and perfectly frame the way in which race frames certain public health issues as issues that are embodied in certain peoples, and therefore the basic way to frame it and to deal with it is to contain those. And of course, the reflexive projection to the other people, it's a moment of racism against the people to whom it's projected upon. But interestingly, it's also a projection that undermines even those who believe that they're protecting themselves by, you know, excluding other people, which, you know, I can't figure out what the heck is going on with some of the red states other than, you know, that internalized white supremacy actually being of danger to them. We're going to talk more about that next week, but it's just really striking the ways that white supremacy, you know, works. You know, white supremacy can be a very dangerous drug. I'm going to move to Mari at this moment in light of some of the issues that Danny raised about anti-Asian harassment, hatred, and violence. A variety of people have tried to deploy different strategies to combat racism that's related to the Chinese virus, as it's called. So recently, Andrew Yang wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. And in this op-ed, he argued that the best way to combat racism related to COVID-19 was for Asian Americans to demonstrate their Americanness. And, you know, his illustration of that was the example of Japanese Americans who enlisted in the military during World War II. There's just like, there's so much to unpack here. I don't want to say anything more than what's important for people to know about this strategy?
It doesn't work. But I would really like to say to Andrew Yang, as a Japanese American, my father was born in Los Angeles, US citizen. He volunteered for World War II from a concentration camp. He is the only survivor of his original squad. How dare you use that history to push this myth that if we just act more American, the racism will stop? Are you seriously going to tell that to children in Midland, Texas, who were slashed in the face, knifed by racists? Or a woman just this week in the Bronx who was beaten on a bus and had to get stitches in her forehead? Anytime someone is suggesting an individual blaming solution to the structural problem of racism, alarm bells should go off for those of us who have studied the history of racism against Asian Americans in this country.
Mm, mm, mm. You know, just have to sit and take that in, you know, for a moment. You know, of course, assimilationism, even in the best of times, you know, for people of color, has, you know, not proved to be a predictable way of survival, not to mention some of the cultural dimensions of it. But for that to be articulated now, when the very embodiment is the subject of, you know, slashing and violence, it is jaw-dropping. It is sort of stunning. And I guess I want to ask, so what's your sense about why these strategies of we just prove ourselves and this won't happen are so sustainable? I mean, it's kind of shocking, actually, that someone would promote this kind of idea rather than confront head on, you know, the racism. So I'm just curious, why does it continue? Is there an exceptionalism that's part of this kind of claim? How should we understand it?
Well, I think people like you have pointed out that the ability in the United States to deny the reality of what white supremacy has done, how it's structured wealth and power in this country, is profound, and it affects how people are educated. So I consider Andrew Yang an example of the miseducation of the Asian American. You know, most people graduate from elite institutions in this country without any exposure to the ideas of critical race theory, without any exposure to the kind of Asian American history that Danny was talking about earlier. And Yang's kind of naive ignorance about this history, and the idea that he doesn't understand that, you know, for those Chinese families that can trace back to the 19th century, they're now in their 7th and 8th generation of proving their Americanness. And still, you can be walking down the street and boom, that racist assault will happen. But I think you only understand the failure of assimilationist strategies if you know the history. And the ignorance of the history is a constructed ignorance. And I'll shout out now the students at Harvard University who are still in a struggle to get basic ethnic studies 101 taught at their very expensive, prestigious institution. This is over 40 years after Professor Crenshaw led a boycott at Harvard University against a racist curriculum. So
it is. Yeah. And again, I mean, these are illustrations, they're exhibits. I think that largely, you know, the conversation that probably most needs to be had is between those of us who see the impact of racial ignorance and folks who consider themselves our allies, but don't necessarily know, well, why do we have to have ethnic studies? Why do we have to continue to drag up, these histories? Well, this is why. If you're appalled by the attack on Asian Americans in the streets, if you're agape at hearing about children who people are trying to push them out of school, then understand what the significance of that is when students and faculty are trying to push for deeper investment in historicizing the country we now live in. So on that, I want to turn to Rosa Clemente and call back just a bit what Dallas and Rinku illustrated, what we've been seeing in New York, what we've been seeing in Louisiana and Indian country. We could consider these the contemporary consequences of racialized disasters of the past. It's like there have been disasters, and then the approach to the disasters have simply reinforced the vulnerability of particularized communities. So speaking of disaster, it was just 2 years ago that the world watched while 45 completely abandoned Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Maria. So, we've heard about how the abandonment of New Orleans has positioned people there. Has governmental negligence endangered Puerto Ricans bracing for COVID?
Well, first, thank you for having me on, and hello to everybody out there. No, I mean, I think colonialism has done that. Like, I know that if Hurricane Maria had happened, while there was a President Barack Obama, he wouldn't have come and thrown paper towels at us, but I don't think he would have done that much of a difference in Puerto Rico, especially in light of him and the Democratic Party really dealing a death blow to the island before Hurricane Maria, which then put us in the worst economic precarious situation ever, which was champion the Promesa bill, which Promesa, when it was passed, and the only Democrat to stand against it was Senator Bernie Sanders. It was written by 2 Puerto Rican Congress people, Nidia Velasquez and Jose Serrano. It was championed by the CBC and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And there was a testimony when Lin-Manuel Miranda said that the best thing to happen to Puerto Rico would be Promesa, which would restructure the so-called debt and would now make—
And Rosa, tell the audience what Promesa—
Yeah, Promesa was to restructure the debt in Puerto Rico that was already astronomically high post the 2008 recession. And although many Puerto Ricans from the island and here begged Barack Obama and all those Democrats to not pass Promesa, which would then allow any money coming in for more than half of it to go to debt and to bondholders, they did not listen to us. So then 2 years later, of course, you have then Hurricane, not just Maria, Hurricane Irma came first, and then Hurricane Maria that devastated the island. So were the Republicans who they always are? 100%. But Puerto Rico is in that position and continue to be in that position because over 125 years of United States colonialism and imperialism. So now with what's happening on the island the last 2 years is that the federal judge, less than a year ago, there was a federal judge in New York City that said 80% of Puerto Rico's revenue will now go to pay the debts in Puerto Rico. So before anything gets fixed in Puerto Rico, 80% of that money goes to the debt. So we've had that. We've had hundreds of
how has it impacted then with so many of the resources being stolen basically to pay for the debt? how does that undermine the ability of people on the island to be protected? We've read that actually some of the more draconian curfews and punishments are happening in Puerto Rico. So it's sort of, one of the ways that policing makes up for lack of resources is to turn things into a criminalizable problem. Is that part of what?
I mean, well, if I could just finish the point on what happened with this federal mandate, is that that's where we began to see more shutting down of hospitals. We've had much flight of doctors, especially young doctors, who, because there has been no Medicaid reimbursement from the US federal government for over 3 years, doctors were not getting paid, which is why you see such a heavy migration of doctors, especially young doctors, to Miami. So you're right, what has happened in Puerto Rico with the new governor, Wanda Vasquez, has been the most draconian efforts we saw. Because what happened was when the one of the cruise ships disembarked, they let people off that cruise ship. And there was an Italian woman who had the virus, and they started contacting her contact. So Wanda Vasquez not only put in a curfew very quickly, never told anyone. There's still a lot of rolling blackouts, which makes communication hard on the island. And just this week, she raised the fine from $500 to $5,000 if you're breaking the curfew, and also 6 months in jail. And with that, I want people to think, like, none of us could really probably afford $5,000, but the median income of a family in Puerto Rico is $21,000 a year. So there are those very harsh draconian measures. And lastly, the police who are being forced to do this work have had some of the highest of murder rates, where they've been killing their partners, mostly women, at the highest rates in the Western Hemisphere, because of kind of all the stress from before, and now the stress now of just an economic nightmare on the island.
Thank you, Rosa. Before we move on to our roundtable discussion, we have a lot on the table, and our goal is to revisit the pictures that have been painted and try to draw connections between them, understanding that these racialized histories intersect with histories of imperialism, slavery, settler colonialism. They are particular and they are also linked. But before we move on to that, I want to check back into our conversation online. And to do that, I'm going to turn it over to Janine. Janine?
Thank you, Kim. So the conversations, now that we're in the heat of this wonderful conversation, really speaking to lack of infrastructure between indigenous populations outside of the US, including Puerto Rico, and again, also in underserved Black communities. People are very concerned about the lack of hospitals, the lack of healthcare. This seems to be a thread that is moving through all of these areas, and it is something that people are incredibly concerned about. And then, of course, speaking to what was at the top of the conversation, Andrew Yang, and this need for people to push back against the idea of assimilation. People are very concerned about that. They know that it doesn't work. They're talking about it, and they know that it's something that needs to be addressed in the future. So moving forward, yes, please keep chatting. Please keep tweeting. We're going to make sure that we get all of your comments addressed at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine, very much. Great to hear that the conversation is still going. So I want to like circle back around and just pick up some of the frames that people have brought to fore quickly with Asali. We've been talking about the environmental racism frame in which heightened vulnerability is framed as a feature of neighborhoods, or it's framed in terms of diseased or distressed communities. There's something slightly off about that. There's something slightly off about what I think is the emerging conversation about the disproportionate death rate from COVID. It's going to be framed like, well, what's in those people that is creating the problem. So what's missing in your sense from this framing that places the problem inside of us or inside of our communities?
I mean, well, I think it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had on various levels around what you describe as, agency. In New Orleans, one of the things that we are working on in looking at our place-based outcomes, because everything is, all of our equity issues are zip code related, as in most places. And so really doing a review of our policies to look at those which lead to disparity, which lead to differences in income and health outcomes and all of those things. And particularly for climate, I mean, there's a large body of work and lots of studies that have been done that show that, climate disruption and, climate injustice, all of the, horrible things that are happening to the climate are largely the result of, we talk about human activity, but in particular, it's the activity of wealthy white people. It is for activities that directly benefit them. It is for activities that directly enrich them and improve their qualities of life. And the outcomes of those activities are all designed, intentionally placed inside of communities of color and poor communities. So there's no, mystery, about that. It's, it's evident. It always has been evident, I believe. And, now that they are putting the numbers to it, it makes it easier for us to, to make an argument around it. But I don't think that it is changing as of yet any impetus for policy. And that's where, this discussion really has to live.
Yeah. On that note, Dallas, I want to come to you because, as I was talking with Sally, it's more or less, the frames that locate disease in the places where Black people choose to live. And of course, when it comes to Native peoples, they're living on their land, right? So it sort of requires us to think about the particularities of settler colonialism, the risks, the consequences, and its ideologies, right, that naturalizes some of these conditions that you talked about. So how can we, or do we think about this moment of crises as an illustration of an embodiment of settler colonialism?
Great question. I can't help but I'm getting like worked up and emotional listening to this. I think that it really is a needed conversation, right? To take a step back and look at what are the greater mechanisms at play in this situation right now, and how are we addressing it? Because I'm really concerned about what is the world going to look like after COVID-19, right? Yeah. Because really what we're talking about, what I'm hearing in this conversation is the two primary operative mechanisms that uphold white supremacy and capitalism, and that is anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, working hand in hand to diminish the quality of life of communities of color, but also to legitimize the continuation of capitalism, to say, okay, we just got to get back to the status quo. Meanwhile, a lot of our communities, the status quo is what got us into this critical situation.
Yeah.
And Asali, you put it perfectly, and I may be in danger of paraphrasing or mansplaining it, but I just think it has to be driven home, is that, Black folks, Native folks, these certain communities are not getting sick because they're Black or because they're Native. It's because we have health conditions that are not of our own making. We don't just have asthma. We just don't have heart difficulties breathing or compromised immune systems just because we are. It's because the system has created the conditions in which we live sometimes that have compromised our immune systems. The system itself has diminished the quality of our life to where we are now more at risk. And we have to call out that system for what it is. And so, like, really, that's at the heart of climate justice. That's the heart of social justice. That's why we really have to bring it back to the bigger picture of what's the system doing to kill us, right? And how are we rising up against that? And so, by connecting these dots is absolutely essential for us to really have greater tools to support our frontline communities.
Well, can I just say something, Kim, to just build off that, what Dallas was just saying real quick?
Go ahead.
I think something too, and well, not that I think, something that's happening between particularly Black and Brown communities of young people, poor working people, young people that are part of hip hop culture and kind of YouTube culture, is there are daily videos being made by particularly what we would call the Hotep kind of community in a, unfortunately, pejorative way, that are still talking about how Black people don't get the virus. And that's a big conversation, and a lot of community, like poor in the hood, in the bodegas, in the barrios, where people are like, Black people don't get it. Or second, it was a biological thing that went out of control, which, look, it could be very true, but I think we have to address that, but also speak to why is there a historical distrust of particularly African American and Puerto Ricans against the medical system. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment and 30 years of uncontrolled birth control and sterilization methods on Puerto Rican women and African American women in Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx. So I think those are things too that we're going to have to start unpacking as communities in these certain segments of our communities.
So, building on that, I want to bring Rinku back in, because part of what Rosa is bringing up for us is both the question of historical reasons for mistrust and lack of targeted information and mechanisms to reach communities that are, socially marginalized, not necessarily being addressed through mainstream media. And so it raises, for me, a couple concerns, particularly with respect to journalism. So around the world, there's this concern that COVID is going to be like a Trojan horse that facilitates crackdowns on journalists. And I don't think it's too much of a leap to suspect that it might be traditionally marginalized journalists, and in turn, our access to information that's most at risk. And in this regard, I'm thinking about the president's efforts to shame and silence, Yamiche Alcindor in this vein. So what are your thoughts about the opportunistic repression of information that this is representing and how it may impact communities of color?
So I think one of the most important things we can do right now is support local journalists who are reporting on what is actually happening in our hotspots and in our communities. And I think that ranges from making donations to your local hyper-local outlet. I know Oakland has a hyper-local outlet. I know New Orleans has a hyper-local outlet. So I think really either supporting the hyper-local reporting that is happening or starting to do it yourself. I think this is a time where citizen journalism is going to be totally critical. And I also think it's important actually to support our daily papers. So if it was me, I'd be sending some donations to all of the independent outlets that I trust, especially local ones. And I would also be subscribing to my local newspaper. There is evidence that people who are tracking this pandemic, when they read print when they read the newspaper or they get their news from network TV, they're getting more accurate information. It's social media that is spreading inaccurate information. And just one last thing, and then I'm going to stop. I think it's really critical to organize to push our systems, healthcare systems, labor systems, transportation systems, democracy, civic systems. But in the very immediate, we have to survive. So the way to do that, I think, is actually through mutual aid. And I have a friend who goes to the hospital for care. She takes a white person with her. It's really a Black friend who takes a white person with her. It's very hard when you're sick to advocate for yourself. Can we think about accompanying people? We should be demanding antibodies tests so that we can actually figure out who among us can go out safely and help. So mutual aid, lots of organizing, support your local journalists.
And, you know, while I have you, let me just get your sense of the government's role in providing information, particularly racial data. So as we know, Senator Warren, Representative Presley have both called for reporting of racial data. But as far as I know, the CDC still has been stonewalling. Some states have refused to release racial data. And I think some folks might think, well, maybe they just don't have it. You know, maybe they're not, collecting it. But Rinku, I'm wondering, what is this battle over racial data sort of telling us? What is it? Why is this such a battle? Where have you seen it before? Should we be worried outside of, this?
We should definitely be worried. We had to organize for more than a decade to get data collected on driving while Black and driving while brown. So there's no reason to expect that it's going to be different this time. The institutions are reluctant to turn over data, or either to collect it or to turn it over, because they know it's going to be horrifying and unacceptable. And so we have to push really, really hard. And in the interim, we have to start collecting that data ourselves. We have to actually do some participatory research projects. And I think at this point, it doesn't even matter how small scale they are. You do a survey of your extended family and put those results out on Twitter. Who could get a test? Who could get care? Who didn't make it through? And so I think we need to collect data ourselves while we push for institutions to give it to us.
Thank you, Rinku. On this note, I want to come back to you, Mari, particularly on the question of, racial data, racial knowledge. So you had said at an earlier point that the pandemic reveals structures that critical race theorists have written about for years. Can you illustrate?
Sure. Well, going back to what Sally said, if your life chances are determined by your zip code, what determined what zip code you ended up in? And that goes back to very intentional strategies of urban development and redlining, complicity between banks, insurance companies, and the state to advantage some people and disadvantage other people on the basis of race. So, Professor Crenshaw, you and I are old enough to grow up in a world in which it was legal to have in the deed of a house, you may not sell this house to a Black person, an Asian person, or a Jew. These were legally created structures of segregation, and we live with the legacy of that. But also our economic system that is built on racialized advantage taking and extraction, going all the way back to genocide of Native Americans and chattel slavery, was the engine of wealth building in this country. And for us to act as though that didn't set the stage for levels of advantage and disadvantage, both at the hard economic material level, but also at the ideological level that we've been talking about. Who's viewed as someone who is supposed to get sick? Well, it's your fault that you got sick. Why do you have that comorbidity? Maybe you should have exercised more, without talking about what is your access to health, to a place to exercise, a park, a tree, or healthy food in your community.
And it also reminds me about the many battles that we've had over the last 30 years about the need to sustain the capacity to access racial data in order to mark discrimination and domination. One of the main tools of the conservative, anti-affirmative action, anti-equity juggernaut was to go after the very capacity to collect racial data. If you don't have racial data, you don't have anything to argue about, right? There's no claim that you can make. And so we're going to take away your ability to even aggregate what is happening on a racial basis, so that there's no fight about it. And you know, let's be clear as well. It's not just the right wing that really pushed a colorblind agenda. The whole celebration around post-racialism in many ways took the capacity and the imperative of collecting racial data off the table, at least framed it as sort of last, generation's issue. So now we're seeing some of the consequences of people being skittish about reflecting information on the basis of race. Danny, I want to come back to you because we were talking a little earlier about the connections between these different systems of subordination. And many times people see them as being like separate, right? So there's, racism and sexism separate. There's colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, racism. And that people have big fights about which ism is at stake now. And I think we have, a sense that, yes, racism works in distinct ways through these different systems, but we struggle sometimes with trying to put them together in a way that's meaningful. So how do you view or think about intersectional analysis as a way to help us see the implications of these different systems, particularly in the way they're playing out now?
That's such an important question. And I think one of the things that we learned from your work, Kim, the intersectionality is not just a critique of how racism works, it's actually a criticism also of the limitations of certain approaches to anti-racism and to feminist politics that try to kind of cordon off and think that domination just works through these, pretty simplistic ways. What you described as a single access notion of discrimination. And this gets back to the Andrew Yang story, and it even gets back to how Asian Americans might respond to these hate incidents, which is if you just think it's something particular about you, disconnected from all of these other systems and frameworks, then you're just incentivized to try to protect yourself and safeguard yourself and actually not pay attention to what's happening at other places. But for Asian Americans now to think that this spate of anti-Asian violence can just be solved with some kind of like consciousness raising or, trainings about tolerance, and then leave undisturbed what Dallas is talking to us about what's happening in Navajo reservations, what's happening in New Orleans, what's happening in Puerto Rico, actually misses the ways that our anti-racist politics have to trace out these connections. It doesn't mean that they're the same. I understand that what's happening to an Asian American student in Southern California is not the same that's what's happening to Black communities in New Orleans, or people that can't access a hospital in Puerto Rico or a doctor. But our politics have to be able to trace what some of those connections are, not to lump them together, but to think about the connections, because I think that the kind of systems of power are, they thrive on our inability to recognize and see one another in that way. And just the last thing I want to say about this is, this is a point that Rosa made. It is impossible to breathe this air of racial domination and it's not just internalize it, but take up some of it ourselves. We become weaponized against one another. And so this has to be part of our organizing practice, is to be able to trace out some of those connections, not to make them the same. They're not the same, but to think about their intersections.
Yes, yes. Well, as you were speaking, I was checking out the question box, and much of what you were saying was being amplified. Jason Wu reminds us that Professor Matsuda has said the strategy is ask the other question. So there is a love, Professor Matsuda, of the audience to hear you say something about that. So we're transitioning into our last 25 minutes. So I'm going to lift up some of the questions that have been coming through, and please keep them coming. They're really wonderful engagements. And so our panelists are going to think about answering some of the questions as they share with us what needs to happen and who needs to make it happen. Right? So what's the world have to look like in this post-COVID world, and what is being done or what can be done to make that happen? So here's a couple of questions. Top 5 suggestions so far to help what minorities would need to do right now, or top 3 or just top 1. This is Dio Thomas, and we're going to go for top 1, Dio. So they'll tell us that in a minute. Kapil Chowsky, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, but do want to give folks a shout out who are taking the time to give us questions. I'm interested in parallels between COVID epidemic exposing racial discrimination in the US and the exposure of religious discrimination in India, particularly against Muslims who, due to pilgrimage or religious congregations, were among the first to be affected. So that's an important question. And we also want to flag that we will do a global conversation in the coming weeks. But if anyone has some thoughts about that now, they're welcome. How can we protect essential employees, especially ones of vulnerable populations, while ensuring that public safety and our infrastructure is maintained? That's coming from Shania Montefar. We have someone who is asking, has anyone spoken about French doctors wanting to test vaccinations on the African population? That is also an issue that will be coming up. So I'm throwing those out for folks to incorporate if they would like in their bringing forward some of the work that they're doing and the organizations are doing. So Dallas, I'm going to go first to you. What are some of the things that are happening to support folks in Indian country? What is your organization doing, and what are some others that people need to know about?
Well, I think that there's we're seeing a lot of usage of mutual aid, community mutual aid programs or apparatuses or whatever you may call them, popping up all over the place. And it's really unique for a lot of rural communities because of the dynamics of just the distances between communities. But that's been pretty strong to see. Organization I work for, the Indigenous Environmental Network, just created a fund called the Indigenous COVID-19 Mutual Aid Fund. So folks that have extra, if you have the resources and want to support some of the work that we're doing, definitely check out that. You can go to that fund. And if folks on our frontline Indigenous communities can also access that fund. And that fund is not just for people that live within the boundary of the so-called United States of America, but for relatives of North and South America across Turtle Island and beyond. I think that what I'm seeing, and this is strictly coming from an Indigenous diaspora, from a perspective of indigeneity and Indigenous nationhood, is a lot of communities asserting their self-determination and sovereign right by establishing checkpoints of saying, look, you are not allowed to come into our community because you're going to be putting us at greater risk. That's happening in South Dakota, Montana, up in Alaska, up in Canada. There's communities who have established their own community checkpoints run by their own people, saying, look, if you're an outsider, you're not allowed to come into our community, and they're regulating that. And I love that for so many different reasons. I love that for one, it's a direct expression of Indigenous nationhood, but it's also normalizing the language around protecting your borders and protecting your community. You know, I want to be careful about the word borders, but it's really for us as indigenous peoples, it's protecting the territories of our and the land in which we live. So I think that's really a moment for us to like really consider, because we're I think you had Naomi Klein on before, and she talks a lot about shock doctrine. A lot of folks talk about slides and shock and all that. What happens when there's chaos within the capitalist system, and how, you know, there's a lot of slide going back and forth about what is the norm. And here's an opportunity for a lot of our communities to establish a sense of sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm not speaking. I'm saying that not just from a perspective of an indigenous sovereigntist. I'm also talking about folks that are advocating constantly for Black liberation, for other communities of color who are actually advocating for a sense of control over what's happening in their community, self-determination, I guess what I'm saying. So that's where I'm seeing a lot of resource and people putting energy into that I would love to continue to support.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Rosa, what work are you seeing happening, and where would you direct people's energies?
I mean, I'm in Albany, New York, so it's such a very different situation. But there are two things that I would love to see happen. And when Rinku talked about citizen journalism, right now in Cuomo's daily press conferences to this day, there has not been one reporter of color allowed in those press conferences. And I want people to start to begin to fight for that, because we know it's the reporters of color that are then going to ask why Cuomo, the greatest white hope to everybody in America apparently right now, has refused to talk about what's going on in the juvenile detention centers, the immigrant holding centers, the deaths in Sing Sing prison, and the 500 COs in Rikers Island that have been diagnosed with coronavirus. And I think if we had some type of citizen journalist there, or let's just say a true journalist who's just not asking questions, but really going in deeply. We're seeing the numbers right now, and de Blasio and Cuomo talk about how they are so surprised and upset about how African American Latinx people are being disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. But those statistics are wrong, because they're not counting those incarcerated people. So if you're telling me 38% of African Americans in New York State have the coronavirus, let's just say we add the prison population, we could be at high numbers of 50% or higher. So that's what I would like to see. And I would like to see people more supporting RAP, the movement right now that is really pushing hard to release aging people in prisons. You know, so I think going back to what Rinku said, that's important. And on the journalism part, lastly, as I have a 15-year-old daughter, I would gather at this point, 25-year-old and younger people have never read a newspaper. They don't care to read a newspaper. They're not reading the New York Times. They're not watching CNN. But where they are going are on TikTok and YouTube and WhatsApp. And we have to find a way as journalists to have information there in bites that they can handle, that does not become so mentally distressing for them right now, but keeps them informed. And that's the type of journalism I'm doing as much as I can on a nightly basis. I'm doing an Instagram live show, and I've had up to 50,000 viewers. And most of them are young people who don't really watch any media but what's on social media. So that's the kind of work I'm trying to do.
Thank you. Danny, you're an academic activist, so where are you directing your energies? What and what would you, I think more broadly, want to see come out of this moment?
Well, maybe I'll talk about one opening in particular related to healthcare. So, the Sanders campaign is pulled out of the race today, And long before this crisis happened, we understood that at the heart of it, a privatized market-based healthcare system underlies many of the assumptions that some people are life-worthy and others are death-worthy that we're seeing. But I think part of what the COVID crisis has revealed is we can't just talk about a universal approach to healthcare if we don't deal with these very specific histories of medical racism, of the particular ways that colonialism has affected indigenous people, of how colonialism affected Puerto Rico. So I think we have an opportunity now to think about, we absolutely have to fight for these broad-based social programs. Mutual aid is critical, but ultimately, it's not going to care for all of us. It can get us there, but we need to maintain a vision where everyone is cared for. But the language of universalism hasn't gotten us there because it hasn't specifically taken up the very racialized ways that some people are viewed as saving and as worthy of health and other people are not. So for me, this is a reminder that for the next stage of these efforts to really fight for robust public programs, we have to think about how the opponents to that are always going to make use of these racial differences and histories.
Thank you, Danny. To do this fight, we've had a sense that we need to understand what's happening. We need to understand our histories and how they relate to one another. We need information that points to the need for good journalism and accessible journalism. But we also need inspiration. We need to figure out how do we put one foot in front of the other in this moment. So I'm going to press on our last three speakers just to ask, where are you finding it? How are you galvanizing it? What is it that you use on a day-to-day basis? So I'm going to, Rinku, ask you.
I am super inspired by mutual aid. That is, I agree with everyone saying that is not going to be enough. But I think one of the things I'm super concerned about is the breaking down of our social bonds because we can't be together and see each other. So I think we have to pay attention to building those, strengthening those while we're doing whatever else we're doing, whether it's mutual aid or organizing for, single payer healthcare or to decarcerate people who are still in prisons. So social bonds is what I think about a lot and what I go out looking for. Well, I don't go out, but what I look for in my screens and, phone calls and email.
Mm-hmm. Mari, what inspires you? What's your fuel right now?
This is a moment of incredible possibility to me. The status quo is broken, and all those images you showed, people standing in the rain, waiting to get into a hospital. We've heard of other people sick in their apartments, told do the best to take care of yourself because we don't have any room for you in the hospital. People thinking, what if something happens to me? Who's going to take care of my kids? The idea that the market ought to determine what your life chances are, that individuals ought to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. I think we see how crazy and corrupt that notion is. The only way is for us to see each human as valuable and to take care of one another so that we know we won't be alone in our hour of need. And we've been running our country in the exact opposite way. Winner take all, the billionaire's ball, and everybody else forgotten. And now large numbers of us realize that we were considered expendable. People in my age group are considered expendable. And we have to watch out for this because there's going to be a lot of pressure to end the shutdowns and get everybody back to work. And part of the calculus is it's okay to lose some people. What gives me inspiration, thank you, you put up the picture from Hawaii of the Mauna Kea protectors. And that front line was all elders, the people that hold the wisdom, the strength, the vision that's going to get us through this. They are not expendable, but they are offering a vision. When we talk about leave it in the ground, we have the images from Standing Rock. The idea that we should take less, protect the earth, take care of one another, is the idea that is going to win, because it's what's going to get us out of this. And there are going to be more and more people ready to organize around that idea. So I feel like it's our duty to fight for our freedom, and we're going to do it, and we're going to win.
Thank you, Marg. So Asali, you are our artist in residence. And I wanted to save what I anticipate is, you know, a particularly profound moment of recognizing that, you know, you're in New Orleans. It is a place that is still reeling from the loss of bodies, you know, both people who were lost, but people who were shipped out and never brought back. And people talk about that a lot, but what they talk less about is the cultural losses. Even when we talk about the schools now having been, you know, totally sort of privatized, what's not often talked about, what's the consequence of that, you know, for cultural production, for what our people in particular have always had with us as the soundtrack of survival, right? That's not as available. So
That's right.
that was both what you're doing organizationally, but then importantly, what you're doing in the home as a way of reclaiming that.
So thank you, Kim. Thank you for this entire conversation. Thank you to my colleagues on the panel for a very honest and passionate and intersectional conversation. I truly appreciate it. Organizationally, at Ashe, we are partnering with other cultural organizations here in the city, other small cultural organizations, and we reprogram some of our dollars, some of our operational and programming dollars to provide emergency response grants for artists and cultural workers here in the city. You know, what we're finding that in the workforce infrastructure here, you know, as I mentioned earlier, our cultural workers provide the bedrock of our industry, but make the least, and they are being missed by all of the organizational, you know, safety net systems, because many of them are self-employed and gig economy workers and those kinds of things. They just don't have the protections. They don't have access to the you know, even the stimulus stuff. So we are doing $2,000 grants. We partner with 3 other small local organizations to repurpose some of our programming money to provide that for our constituents, for our artists and culture bearers, many of them elders, you know, right here at the beginning of the festival season, when many of them have invested, you know, so much money and time and inventory into that. And, you know, it's that opportunity is wiped out for them. Personally, for me, The Guardian released an article in January that I have just been clinging to called The Search for Eden. And it talks about culture as the #1 most valuable resource of humanity, as the one thing that has kept us alive, you know, through these millennia. And, you know, it's a really wonderful in-depth article. I encourage everyone to read it. But what it made me think of, you know, for my children, I thought of the African-American spirituals, the Negro spirituals, the slave songs, whatever, you know, name folks want to appropriately or inappropriately give it. You know, those songs, I remember them growing up, and, you know, sometimes things would happen that I couldn't even name, and, you know, would call up one of those songs. And I know that my children have less access to those songs because in our you know, charter school system with hardly any Black teachers, you know, all Black teachers in New Orleans were fired after Katrina. Like, that's just a fact. They teachers were wholesaled, fired, and not allowed to come back. And so, you know, the teachers that I grew up with and who taught me about who I was and what my connection to my humanity, to my past, and what was possible for my future, those people are no longer in the schools. And the kids who, the teachers who are there, they don't know our children, and they're not invested in our children. And you know, I hate to be cavalier or you know, make a blanket statement, but in general, they really just do not care. At least I don't have evidence of the care, and I think that is something that should be evident. So, you know, really holding on to the Negro spirituals, teaching my kids the Black national anthem, and, you know, all kinds of other songs, because I really think that their generation will need that cultural knowledge to draw upon to get them through the times that they have ahead.
Mm. Thank you so much, Asali, for ending this incredible panel on such a profound note. And thank all of you for joining us. This would not have been possible without the time and effort of our team at the African American Policy Forum and the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. And a very, very special thank you to our panelists, Rinku Sen, Asali Divan Ecclesiastes, Dallas Goldtooth, Danny Hosang, Mari Matsuda, and Rosa Clemente. Thank you for helping us through this crisis. This has been an inspiring and necessary conversation, and we like to urge you all to keep listening, to keep up these kinds of conversations with your friends and your families and within your communities. Now, you can follow us along social media at AA Policy Forum and at our website, aapf.org, as we'll continue to provide information, resources, and opportunities to galvanize our collective experience into an energy that can propel us into another universe of possibilities. We'll do so through the blog on our website, as well as our podcast, Intersectionality Matters. It's available on iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. We'll be posting this conversation in the coming week. And Under the Blacklight continues next Wednesday, featuring another set of essential voices: Kehinde Andrews, Paul Butler, Jonathan Metzl, Bree Newsome, and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. We are more than excited, and we look forward to all of you joining us then. So thank you all. Enjoy your evening. Please stay safe, stay strong as we continue to organize and resist. Good night.